Joe Carter had been a mailman for nearly 20 years. His route wound through the streets of the small Midwestern town of Everdale, where neat houses lined the streets and neighbors still waved to one another. Each home on his route had its unique personality, but there was one house that stood out to Joe, the small brick bungalow at the end of Maple Street. It belonged to Mrs. Agnes Willard, an 82-year-old widow who had lived there for as long as Joe could remember. Mrs. Willard was one of Joe's favorite stops. She had a warm, inviting presence and a knack for storytelling. Most afternoons, she'd be out on her porch, knitting or tending to her vibrant garden of daisies and tulips. Joe would always linger a little longer at her mailbox, sharing a laugh or carrying packages inside for her. Despite her age, Mrs. Willard carried herself with remarkable independence. But over the past few weeks, Joe had noticed changes. The curtains on her windows were often drawn, and the cheerful greetings had dwindled. She'd missed 2 consecutive days of picking up her mail, an unusual occurrence. Concerned, Joe had knocked on her door one morning, but there had been no answer. He convinced himself she might have been out or under the weather. After all, the weather had turned colder, and winters in Everdale could be brutal. On a chilly Monday morning, Joe approached Mrs. Willard's house, the familiar creak of a gate greeting him. To his surprise, she was standing by the mailbox, leaning heavily on a cane. Her figure was frail, her posture hunched, and her usually rosy complexion was pale. She wore a knitted cardigan that hung loosely on her shoulders, and her pants were stained with dark streaks that looked like they had dried hours ago. "Morning, Mrs. Willard," Joe greeted her, trying to mask his concern. "It's good to see you out here." She offered a weak smile. "Morning, Joe. Got anything exciting for me today?" Her voice was quieter than usual, almost raspy. Joe handed her the stack of letters, but couldn't take his eyes off the stains on her pants. "Mrs. Willard, are you all right? Did something happen?" She glanced down at the stains, her hand trembling as she adjusted her grip on the cane. "Oh, it's nothing, dear. I had a little accident inside. You know how clumsy I can be," she said with a strained chuckle. Joe wasn't convinced. His gut told him something was wrong. He glanced toward the house, where the curtains were tightly drawn, and the door was ajar. "Would you like some help inside?" he offered, his tone gentle but insistent. Mrs. Willard hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I suppose that would be all right." As Joe stepped inside the house, a strong metallic smell hit him. His stomach twisted as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The living room, usually tidy and filled with cozy touches like hand-knitted throws and family photos, was in disarray. A chair was tipped over, and a trail of dark stains, blood, Joe realized with a jolt, led from the doorway into the kitchen. "Mrs. Willard, what happened here?" Joe asked, his voice a mix of alarm and urgency. Mrs. Willard lowered herself onto the nearest chair, wincing as she moved. "I fell last night," she admitted. "I was trying to clean up the kitchen and I tripped. My legs, they just gave out." Joe knelt beside her, noticing a deep gash on her forearm. The wound was crusted with dried blood, and bruises mottled her fragile skin. She clutched her cane tightly, her knuckles white. "Mrs. Willard, this isn't just a simple fall," Joe said, his voice firm but kind. "You need medical attention." "I'm calling for help." "No, please," she protested weakly. "I don't want to be a bother." I'll be fine." Joe shook his head. "This isn't negotiable. You're hurt, and you shouldn't be alone right now." Joe stepped outside to make the call, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The dispatcher's calm voice guided him through the process as he explained the situation. Within minutes, the sound of sirens echoed down the quiet street. The ambulance arrived, accompanied by a squad car. Paramedics entered the house, gently examining Mrs. Willard. One of them turned to Joe after assessing her injuries. "She's dehydrated and in shock," the paramedic said. "If you hadn't called, this could have gotten much worse." As they lifted Mrs. Willard onto a stretcher, she reached out to Joe, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she whispered. Joe gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're going to be all right, Mrs. Willard. I'll check on you soon." The following day, Joe visited the hospital with a small bouquet of flowers. He found Mrs. Willard in a clean, bright room, her arm in a sling, and her cheeks looking slightly rosier. "Joe," she said, her voice stronger than before. "You didn't have to come." "Of course I did," he replied, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "You gave me quite the scare yesterday. How are you feeling?" She sighed. "Better, thanks to you. The doctors said I'm lucky I didn't break anything. But it's my arthritis, Joe. It's gotten worse. My legs they're not what they used to be." Joe listened as she opened up about her struggles. Her pride had kept her from asking for help, but the truth was, she'd been struggling to keep up with household chores and cooking. The fall had been a wake-up call she couldn't ignore. "You're not a burden, Mrs. Willard," Joe said gently. "Everyone needs help sometimes." Joe knew he couldn't let Mrs. Willard return home without support. That evening, he reached out to neighbors, local organizations, and even his coworkers. Within days, they had organized a cleaning crew to tidy her house and a schedule for meal deliveries. Volunteers from a local nonprofit installed grab bars in the bathroom and a chairlift on her stairs. Mrs. Willard was overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. "I don't know how to thank you," she told Joe one day as they stood in her newly cleaned kitchen. "You've already thanked me," Joe said with a smile. "Just promise to let us help when you need it." The experience left a lasting impression on Joe. It reminded him of the importance of noticing the small details, a missed greeting, a weary face, or an unusual stain. His act of concern had sparked a wave of compassion that transformed not just Mrs. Willard's life, but also the community's sense of togetherness. For Mrs. Willard, it was a second chance to live independently, surrounded by people who cared. And for Joe, it was a reminder that sometimes being a mailman was about delivering more than just letters. It was about delivering hope. Joe Carter hadn't always been a mailman. In his youth, he dreamed of becoming a musician. His early 20s were spent in pursuit of a career as a guitarist, playing in local bands, and traveling to gigs across state lines. But life had other plans. When his father fell ill, Joe gave up his musical aspirations to return to Everdale and help care for him. Taking a job at the Postal Service seemed temporary at first, but as the years went by, Joe found a unique satisfaction in his work. He came to value the predictability of his route, the routine greetings from familiar faces, and the sense of purpose that came with connecting people to their loved ones through letters and packages. Mrs. Willard, too, had a story that stretched far beyond the walls of her small bungalow. She had been a teacher for over 3 decades, educating generations of Everdale's children. Her late husband, Frank, had been a carpenter known for crafting the benches that dotted the town's parks. Together, they had lived a modest but fulfilling life, devoted to their community. Losing Frank to a heart attack 10 years ago had been a blow, but Mrs. Willard's resilience had carried her through. Seeing the difference these efforts made in Mrs. Willard's life ignited a spark in Joe. He began to notice other elderly residents along his route who might need a helping hand. With the help of local organizations, he started a program called Neighbors Helping Neighbors, aimed at providing support to Everdale's senior citizens. The program quickly gained traction. High school students earned community service hours by assisting with yard work and household chores. Local businesses donated supplies, and a retired nurse volunteered to conduct wellness checks. Joe's initiative became a model for neighboring towns, earning him recognition as a community hero. As the seasons changed, so did the lives of Everdale's residents. Mrs. Willard thrived with her newfound independence, hosting small knitting circles and sharing her legendary stories with friends old and new. Joe continued his daily route, now with an added sense of purpose, knowing he was making a difference beyond delivering mail. Years later, when Joe retired, the town honored him with a plaque at the local post office, commemorating his decades of service and his dedication to the community. Mrs. Willard, still spry at 90, attended the ceremony with a hand-knitted scarf for Joe, a symbol of their enduring friendship. Their story became part of Everdale's lore, a reminder that small acts of kindness could ripple out to create profound change. And for Joe Carter, it was proof that sometimes life's detours led to the most meaningful destinations.